What if we told you that a man survived not one but two atomic bombs? A park ranger got struck by lightning 7 separate times and walked away every single time. A 16-year-old girl rode twice the distance of Paul Revere's famous Midnight Ride, and history forgot her name completely. A shoe salesman started a company from the trunk of his car and built the most valuable sports brand on the planet. And a formerly enslaved man literally stole a Confederate warship, sailed it past 5 enemy checkpoints in the dark, and handed it directly to the Union Navy. These are 111 real people from history who were so stupidly lucky they make winning the lottery look like a participation trophy. Stick around because it only gets more insane from here. 1. Here is a fun fact that will break your brain completely. There was a man named Tsutomu Yamaguchi who survived the Hiroshima atomic bomb blast in 1945, dragged himself to safety, bandaged up his burns like he was just having a rough Monday, and then thought to himself, you know what sounds great right now? Going home. So he hopped on a train to Nagasaki. Yes, that Nagasaki. And 3 days later, the second atomic bomb dropped right on top of him, and somehow this absolute unit of a human being survived that one too. The universe tried to take this man out twice, and failed both times. 2. Meet Roy Sullivan, a Virginia park ranger who had the most shocking career in the history of outdoor employment. Between 1942 and 1977, this man was struck by lightning not once, not twice, but 7 separate times and walked away from every single one. His hair caught fire multiple times, his eyebrows burned off, his shoes blew off his feet, and at one point a bolt hit him while he was inside a ranger station. Guinness World Records confirmed the odds of this happening. To one person were essentially impossible. Roy Sullivan was basically a human lightning rod wearing a park ranger hat and somehow lived to tell about all 7 of them. 3. A young Abraham Lincoln was originally supposed to spend the evening of April 14, 1865, somewhere else entirely. And the terrifying part is how close he came to just staying home. Lincoln had been invited to Ford's Theater, almost as an afterthought, because the original plans for his evening kept shifting around through a series of completely unremarkable last-minute decisions that nobody thought twice about at the time. The venue, the seat, the unguarded door behind him all came together through a chain of tiny accidents that history had no business allowing to line up so perfectly. One different yes or no earlier that day and the entire night plays out completely differently forever. 4. The last-minute change of plans sent Abraham Lincoln to Ford's Theater on the night of April 14, 1865, and nobody talked about what almost happened instead. Lincoln had originally been scheduled to attend a completely different venue that evening, but a series of small, unremarkable decisions shifted his entire itinerary at the last minute. The universe had one specific seat reserved for him that night, and through a chain of tiny coincidences, it made sure he filled it. What makes this even more haunting is that his bodyguard also abandoned his post that same evening to grab a drink at a nearby saloon, leaving the most important man in America completely unprotected. 5. Nobody in American history has ever had a more dramatically poetic exit than John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And these two men built the entire foundation of the United States together, then became bitter political rivals who barely spoke for years, then reconciled through letters, and then on July 4, 1826, exactly 50 years to the day after the Declaration of Independence was signed, both men died within hours of each other. Adams reportedly whispered, "Thomas Jefferson survives," as his final words, not even knowing Jefferson had already passed hours earlier. The odds of this happening by pure chance are so astronomically small that historians still argue about whether the universe was just showing off. 6. George Washington should have been dead before the American Revolution even started, and the fact that he was not is genuinely one of history's greatest accidents. Before he turned 30, this man survived smallpox, malaria, pleurisy, dysentery, Zeus, and tuberculosis, hitting him one after another like the universe was running through a checklist. Any single one of those diseases killed strong, healthy men regularly in the 1700s, and Washington caught all 5 of them and just kept going. If even one of those illnesses had finished the job, there would have been no crossing of the Delaware, no Continental Army, and very likely no United States of America as we know it today. 7. Mel Fisher spent 16 years broke, mocked, and completely broke again, searching for a Spanish shipwreck off the Florida coast that most experts told him simply did not exist. He lost his son and daughter-in-law to a diving accident during the search and still refused to quit showing up every single morning saying today is the day like a man who had completely lost his grip on reality. Then on one ordinary morning in July 1985, just as he was reaching his absolute breaking point, his son radioed from the water and said the words Mel had been waiting 16 years to hear. They had found $450 million worth of gold sitting on the ocean floor, and Mel Fisher was suddenly the luckiest stubborn man alive. 8. During the Civil War, General Ulysses Grant's horse stumbled into a ditch at exactly the right moment, and that clumsy animal accidentally saved the man who would go on to win the entire war for the Union. Grant's horse lost its footing and pinned his leg to the ground, keeping him from joining a scouting mission that had already set off ahead of him. Every single officer who went on that ride was either killed or captured by Confederate forces before they made it back. And Grant sat there frustrated with a sore leg, completely unaware that his stumbling horse had just preserved the military career that would eventually force Robert E. Lee to surrender at Appomattox. 9. Theodore Roosevelt got shot in the chest during a campaign speech in Milwaukee in 1912. And his response to that situation was so unhinged, it became one of the most legendary moments in American political history. The bullet entered his chest but was stopped cold by two things sitting in his breast pocket, which were his folded 50-page speech manuscript and his steel eyeglass case working together like an accidental bulletproof vest. Roosevelt looked down, checked the wound, announced to the crowd that it takes more than that to kill a bull moose, and then stood at that podium and delivered his full 90-minute speech before finally agreeing to go to the hospital. 10. Spencer Silver was a chemist working for 3M in 1968, trying to develop an incredibly powerful adhesive for NASA, and by every professional measure he failed completely and embarrassingly. What he created instead was a glue so weak it could barely hold two pieces of paper together and peeled right off without leaving a mark, which in the world of adhesives is basically the worst possible outcome. Silver tried to get someone at 3M interested in his useless weak glue for years, and nobody cared. Then, a colleague named Art Fry used it to keep his hymnal bookmarks from falling out at church. And suddenly Spencer Silver's spectacular failure became the post-it note and changed office life across the entire planet forever. 11. A carpenter named James Marshall was just doing his regular job building a sawmill at Sutter's Mill in California in January of 1848, when he looked down into the water and noticed something shiny sitting at the bottom that absolutely should not have been there. He picked it up, bit it, hammered it, and slowly realized he was holding gold, and that there was a lot more of it sitting right underneath him. Marshall tried to keep the discovery quiet, but the secret lasted about 5 minutes before the entire country lost its mind completely. That one accidental glance downward by a regular working man triggered the gold rush, flooded California with 300,000 people, and permanently transformed the American West forever. 12. Harry Truman was a young man sitting in a Kansas City grandstand in 1900, enjoying what was supposed to be a perfectly normal day out, when something made him decide to get up and move to a completely different section of the seating area for no particularly important reason. Within minutes of him relocating, the exact section he had just been sitting in collapsed without any warning and killed dozens of the people who had been packed in right around where Truman was sitting moments before. The future president, who would later make the call to drop the atomic bomb on Japan, survived his own close call that day, entirely because of a random and completely unexplainable urge to change his seat. 13. So, a 14-year-old kid named Chester Greenwood from Farmington, Maine, went ice skating one winter in 1873 and spent the whole time absolutely miserable because his ears were so cold he could barely function like a normal human being. Instead of just going inside like any reasonable person, Chester went home, grabbed some wire, bent it into 2 loops, asked his grandmother to sew fur onto them, and strapped the whole contraption onto his head and went right back outside. He patented the design at 18 years old and spent the rest of his life manufacturing earmuffs in Maine. His hometown liked this so much they made Chester Greenwood Day an official annual celebration every December, and it still happens today. 14. While during the Battle of Trenton on Christmas night in 1776, a Hessian officer received a handwritten note from an American loyalist that contained every detail of George Washington's surprise attack, including the exact timing and location of the crossing. The officer was handed this note, looked at it, and then put it directly into his coat pocket without reading a single word because he was in the middle of a card game and did not want to be interrupted. Washington's troops crossed the Delaware, stormed the camp, and captured the entire garrison by dawn. When soldiers searched the officer's coat, they found the note still perfectly folded and completely unread, sitting right there in his pocket the whole time. 15. Alexander Fleming was a Scottish scientist working in London in 1928 who left his lab for summer vacation without cleaning up his Petri dishes, because apparently tidying up was not high on his priority list that particular Friday. When he came back weeks later, he noticed that a random mold had drifted in through the window, landed on one of his dirty dishes, and had killed every single bacteria growing around it in a perfect circle like it was showing off. Fleming stared at that contaminated Petri dish, and instead of throwing it away, had the presence of mind to realize he was looking at something extraordinary. That uncleaned dish became penicillin, and the estimated number of human lives it has saved since then is over 200 million people. 16. John D. Rockefeller was a young businessman in 1864 trying to decide between putting his money into an oil venture or a salt mine, and the two options were close enough that he reportedly settled the decision by flipping a coin, like he was choosing where to eat lunch. The coin came up oil. Rockefeller invested, built Standard Oil into an absolute monopoly that controlled 90% of American oil refining, and accumulated a personal fortune that, when adjusted for inflation, makes him the single wealthiest American in all of recorded history. The salt mine he passed on closed within a few years and was completely forgotten. One coin flip separated comfortable obscurity from the greatest fortune this country has ever seen. 17. A Confederate spy named Bell Boyd was arrested by Union forces 6 separate times during the Civil War and walked free every single time through a combination of charm, legal technicality, and what can only be described as spectacular luck with the men assigned to deal with her. The most unbelievable escape came when the Union officer specifically assigned to build the legal case against her fell completely in love with Bell Boyd during the investigation process, and instead of prosecuting her, he proposed marriage. She said yes, he resigned his commission, and the two of them got married while the Union Army presumably stood there, wondering what had just happened to their court case. 18. Charles Goodyear had been failing at rubber for 5 straight years by 1839, losing money, getting laughed at, and watching every single experiment produce nothing useful while his family went hungry and his creditors came knocking at the door constantly. Then one day in his kitchen, he accidentally dropped a mixture of rubber and sulfur onto a hot stove, and instead of making a mess, it transformed into something completely different right in front of his eyes. The heat had vulcanized the rubber, making it strong, flexible, and heat-resistant in a way nobody had ever achieved before. 5 years of expensive professional failure was solved in 1 second by a kitchen accident and a hot stove that Goodyear had no business being anywhere near. 19. Alvin York was a deeply religious young man from Tennessee who filed for conscientious objector status before World War I because his faith told him that killing was wrong and he wanted absolutely nothing to do with the war in Europe. His appeal was denied, he was drafted anyway, and the army sent him to France presumably, without realizing what they had just unleashed on the German military. On October 8, 1918, York single-handedly killed 28 German soldiers and then convinced a German major to order the surrender of 132 more enemy troops essentially by himself. The man who tried his hardest not to fight in the war became the most decorated American soldier of the entire conflict. 20. Our Andrew Jackson was standing in the Capitol Rotunda in January of 1835 when a man named Richard Lawrence walked up and pointed 2 loaded pistols directly at the President of the United States from point-blank range and pulled both triggers one after the other. Both guns misfired. The odds of 2 loaded pistols both failing to discharge in sequence have been calculated at roughly 1 in 125,000. Jackson, who was 67 years old and already furious about basically everything, did not wait for anyone to intervene and immediately started beating Lawrence with his walking cane so aggressively that bystanders had to physically pull the president away from his own would-be assassin. 21. Mark Twain came into this world in 1835 during the appearance of Halley's Comet, that giant blazing spectacle that swings past Earth only once every 75 years, and he spent decades publicly telling anyone who would listen that he fully intended to leave with it too. He announced with complete confidence that it would be the greatest disappointment of his life if he did not depart this Earth alongside the comet, just as he had arrived with it. Astronomers, doctors, and sensible people probably smiled politely and said, "Sure, Mark, whatever you say." Then, on April 21st, 1910, the day after Halley's Comet made its return appearance in the night sky, Mark Twain died peacefully in his bed, exactly as he had predicted, like he had personally negotiated the terms with the universe years in advance. 22. Warren Buffett applied to Harvard Business School as a young man, sat through his admissions interview, and was rejected so completely that the interviewer apparently saw nothing particularly promising in the quiet kid from Omaha sitting across the table. Buffett was devastated and enrolled at Columbia University instead, which under normal circumstances would feel like a significant step down from his original plan. But Columbia happened to employ a professor named Benjamin Graham, who had essentially invented the entire concept of value investing, and who took Buffett under his wing personally and taught him everything. Harvard Business School rejected the man who would become one of the 3 wealthiest humans in recorded history and handed him directly to the one teacher who could make that happen. 23. Sir Sam Walton built his first retail store in Newport, Arkansas, into a thriving, successful business through pure determination and relentless hard work, and was genuinely proud of what he had created from nothing in that small town. Then his landlord read the fine print of the lease agreement, discovered a clause that allowed him to reclaim the property without renewing, exercised that clause immediately, and took the entire building right out from under Walton's feet, leaving him with nothing but the lessons he had learned running it. A lesser man would have quit right there. Instead, Walton used every single thing he had figured out in Newport to start completely over in Bentonville, Arkansas, and the store he built on the ashes of that humiliation became Walmart, currently the largest company by revenue on planet Earth. 24. Andrew Carnegie was a teenage telegraph operator in Pittsburgh in the 1850s, doing a fairly ordinary job tapping out messages when a runaway train situation developed on the line, and the operator who was supposed to handle it was nowhere to be found. Carnegie jumped on the key himself, sent the emergency messages that stopped the trains from colliding, and saved what would have been a catastrophic accident entirely on his own initiative. The superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad heard what the teenager had done, called him into his office, made him his personal assistant, and became Carnegie's most important mentor and professional connection. One teenager making one gutsy decision on one chaotic morning launched the career of the man who would build the most powerful steel empire in American history. 25. Ruth Wakefield was baking a batch of regular chocolate cookies at her Toll House Inn in Massachusetts in 1937 when she reached for her baker's chocolate and realized she had completely run out with guests already on the way and no time to go to the store. She grabbed a Nestlé chocolate bar, broke it into chunks, threw it into the batter, and assumed the pieces would melt down and distribute evenly through the cookies the way baker's chocolate always did. They absolutely did not melt. The chunks stayed intact, got slightly soft and gooey, and produced something that her inn guests immediately went completely insane over. Ruth Wakefield had just invented the chocolate chip cookie entirely by accident because she forgot to go grocery shopping, and America has been obsessed with it ever since. 26. Jimmy Carter was a nuclear engineer in the United States Navy in 1952 when a reactor at a Canadian facility suffered a partial meltdown and someone needed to go inside the damaged reactor building to manually dismantle the core before the situation got significantly worse. Carter volunteered, led a small team of men into the live reactor in carefully timed shifts to limit their radiation exposure, and spent a total of 90 seconds inside the core personally dismantling components with his bare hands, while absorbing a calculated dose of radiation that would have terrified most people into retirement. He survived without lasting physical damage, left the Navy, went back to Georgia to grow peanuts, and eventually became the 39th President of the United States. 27. Ole Evinrude was a young man in Wisconsin in 1906 who decided to take his girlfriend out to a small island on a lake for a romantic afternoon, and everything was going beautifully until she mentioned she wanted ice cream, and the ice cream was on the other side of the lake. Ole rowed all the way across, got the ice cream, and rowed all the way back in summer heat, watching the ice cream melt into soup the entire time he was rowing and getting more frustrated with every single stroke. That specific frustration of sitting in a rowboat watching ice cream die, planted an idea in his head that he could not shake loose. He went home, built a small gasoline-powered motor that could attach to a boat, and founded the Evinrude Outboard Motor Company, which became one of the most successful marine engine businesses in American history. 28. Say Benjamin Franklin flew a kite in a thunderstorm in 1752 to prove that lightning was electrical in nature, and the experiment worked brilliantly, which was wonderful for science and also an outcome that was far from guaranteed, given what he was actually doing. What the history books usually leave out is that several European scientists were so inspired by Franklin's results that they attempted the exact same experiment themselves during the same period, and a number of them were electrocuted and killed, trying to replicate what Franklin had pulled off. Franklin survived because of specific details in his setup that reduced his direct exposure to the charge in ways he may not have fully understood himself at the time. He did not know he was doing something safer than his colleagues. He just got lucky, and they did not. 29. Now, Steve Jobs co-founded Apple Computer in a garage, built it into a legitimate technology company, and was then removed from the company he had created by his own board of directors in 1985 in one of the most dramatic corporate firings in American business history. He spent 12 years away from Apple building other companies and being largely dismissed by the tech industry as a man whose best days were clearly behind him. Then Apple bought his company next in 1997, brought Jobs back, and handed him the reins of a company that was weeks away from bankruptcy. What he did next produced the iMac, the iPod, the iPhone, and the iPad in succession, making Apple the most valuable company in the history of human commerce and proving that firing him was the single worst business decision ever made. 30. Oprah Winfrey got her first real television job as a news anchor in Baltimore and was so committed to the emotional reality of every story she covered that her producers decided this level of feeling was completely unprofessional and inappropriate for serious journalism. They pulled her off the anchor desk and demoted her to co-hosting a struggling local daytime talk show that nobody was watching and that the station considered basically a dead-end assignment with no future. Oprah sat down in that co-host chair, did exactly what she had always done, which was connect with people with complete emotional honesty, and the ratings immediately started climbing. That dead-end show became the Oprah Winfrey Show, ran for 25 years, made her a billionaire, and turned the woman they demoted for caring too much into the most powerful person in American television history. 31. Audie Murphy showed up to enlist after Pearl Harbor and was turned away by the Marines for being too small, rejected by the Navy for the same reason, and then turned down by the paratroopers before the regular Army finally accepted him out of what was probably desperation. The branches that rejected him probably felt pretty confident about that decision right up until Murphy single-handedly killed 28 enemy soldiers, captured 132 more, and earned every major combat award America offered, including the Medal of Honor. The most decorated American soldier of World War II was literally nobody's first choice and several people's hard pass. 32. So Elvis Presley walked into Sun Records in Memphis in 1953 not to launch a music career, but to cut a cheap vanity record as a birthday gift for his mother, because he was an 18-year-old kid who thought that would be sweet. The studio secretary Marion Keisker heard something unusual in his voice, wrote his name on a scrap of paper with a note, and handed it to producer Sam Phillips months later almost as an afterthought. Phillips called Elvis in, put him in front of a microphone, and what happened next permanently changed popular music across the entire planet. The king of rock and roll was discovered because a secretary kept a scrap of paper. 33. So John Pemberton was a Georgia pharmacist in 1886, desperately trying to create a syrup that would help cure his own morphine addiction when he mixed together a combination of coca leaves and cola nuts into a thick caramel-colored concentrate he thought might work as a headache remedy. An assistant at a nearby drugstore counter accidentally mixed the syrup with carbonated water instead of plain water one afternoon and handed it to a customer who immediately wanted another one. Pemberton's failed addiction cure mixed with someone else's mistake at a soda counter became Coca-Cola, now consumed over 2 billion times every single day across every country on Earth. 34. Ulysses Grant spent the years before the Civil War failing at absolutely everything he attempted, including farming, selling real estate, and collecting bills, by eventually ending up working in his younger brother's leather goods store in Illinois, at nearly 40 years old with nowhere left to fall. When the war started, He rejoined the army simply because he had genuinely run out of other options, and the army was the one thing left that would take him. That decision, born entirely from desperation, produced the general who outmaneuvered every Confederate commander he faced, captured Vicksburg, accepted Lee's surrender at Appomattox, and then served 2 terms as President of the United States. 35. Madam C.J. Walker was a black washerwoman in the 1890s who began losing her hair completely due to a scalp condition and spent years desperately trying every product available to stop it with absolutely no success. Out of pure necessity, she started mixing her own formula, testing it on herself and her neighbors, and eventually developed something that actually worked consistently. She began selling it door to door through black communities across the South and Midwest, built a manufacturing operation, trained a national sales force, and became the first self-made female millionaire in American history. She solved her own personal crisis and accidentally built an empire doing it. 36. Charles Schulz submitted cartoon drawings to his high school yearbook every single year and was rejected every single time by the students running the publication, who apparently looked at his work and collectively decided it was not good enough to include. He then applied to work as an artist for Walt Disney Studios after graduation and was rejected there too. Schulz kept drawing anyway and eventually created Peanuts, a comic strip featuring a lovable loser named Charlie Brown that went on to become the most widely syndicated comic strip in the history of the world, running in over 2,600 newspapers and read by hundreds of millions of people globally. 37. Susan B. Anthony walked into a polling station in Rochester, New York on November 5, 1872, and voted in the presidential election fully knowing it was illegal for women to do so, and that she would almost certainly be arrested for it. Federal marshals showed up at her door 2 weeks later, and she was charged, tried, and convicted in a case that became front-page news from coast to coast and put the question of women's voting rights directly in front of the entire American public. The judge fined her $100, which she publicly refused to pay and never did. The outrage her trial generated directly accelerated the suffrage movement that gave women the vote 48 years later. 38. Hedy Lamarr was one of the biggest Hollywood stars of the 1940s, and also secretly one of the most important inventors of the 20th century, which almost nobody knew because the two things seemed so impossible to combine that people simply did not believe it. During World War II, she co-developed a frequency-hopping radio signal system designed to make Allied torpedoes impossible for the enemy to jam, submitted the patent, and watched the military ignore it completely for decades. The patent expired before anyone used it. Then engineers building wireless communication systems realized her concept was exactly what they needed, and her expired idea became the technical foundation of modern Wi-Fi and Bluetooth used by billions of people every single day. 39. Dwight Eisenhower graduated from West Point in 1915, ranked 61st out of 164 cadets, which is a perfectly adequate result that suggested a solid but entirely unremarkable military career ahead of him. He spent the next 2 decades as a staff officer doing paperwork and planning assignments that kept him far from any actual combat command while watching peers get promoted around him. Then World War II arrived, and someone decided this meticulous planning officer should be given a chance. And Eisenhower planned and commanded Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious military invasion in the history of human warfare, involving nearly 3 million troops across multiple Allied nations simultaneously. 40. Frank Hibbing was a Minnesota mining engineer in 1893 who had done his geological survey work carefully and professionally, and was drilling in what his own calculations told him was completely the wrong location, essentially wasting time and money on a spot the science said would produce nothing. His drill hit something anyway. What came up from the ground beneath that supposedly empty spot turned out to be the largest iron ore deposit ever discovered in American history, a deposit so enormous it supplied the majority of the steel used by the United States during both World War I and World War II. Frank Hibbing was wrong about where to drill, and that mistake fed an entire war effort. 41. Joseph Glidden was an Illinois farmer in 1874, watching his wife lose her mind trying to keep cattle from destroying her garden for what was probably the 100th time that season when something clicked in his brain that had never clicked before. He took some plain wire, twisted sharp metal points along its length using a coffee grinder, and strung it along the garden fence as an experiment to see if the cattle would respect it more than the smooth wire they kept pushing through. They respected it considerably more. Glidden patented the design, manufacturing scaled up almost immediately, and barbed wire spread across the American West so fast it permanently ended the open range era and transformed frontier economics forever. 42. Babe Ruth got into enough trouble as a 7-year-old kid in Baltimore that his overwhelmed father walked him down to St. Mary's Industrial School for Boys and essentially left him there as a consequence for his behavior, which at the time probably felt like a punishment with no upside whatsoever. St. Mary's happened to have a baseball program run by a Xaverian brother named Matthias Boutelier, who was enormous, patient, and could hit a baseball farther than anyone Ruth had ever seen. Brother Matthias took a personal interest in the troubled kid and taught him everything. A punishment handed down to a 7-year-old produced the greatest baseball player in the history of the sport. 43. George H.W. Bush was a 19-year-old Navy pilot in September 1944 when his torpedo bomber was hit by Japanese anti-aircraft fire over the Pacific, and he had to bail out of a burning plane into the open ocean while his 2 crewmates did not make it out. Bush inflated his life raft and floated alone in shark-infested water, waiting for a rescue that had absolutely no reason to come because nobody knew exactly where he was. A United States submarine called the USS Finback happened to be passing through that specific patch of ocean on an unrelated mission, spotted him through the periscope, and pulled him out. The future 41st President of the United States was saved by a submarine that had no business being anywhere near him. 44. Roy Plunkett was a young DuPont chemist in 1938 working on developing a new type of refrigerant gas and left a pressurized canister of the experimental compound sitting overnight in his lab because the workday was done and he was going home like a normal person. When he came back the next morning, the gas inside had completely disappeared and the canister felt wrong, so he cut it open to investigate what had gone wrong with his experiment. The inside walls were coated with a slippery white powder that had polymerized overnight on its own without anyone asking it to. That accidental coating was polytetrafluoroethylene, and Plunkett had just discovered Teflon, which now lines hundreds of millions of cooking pans in kitchens across the entire world. 45. Howard Hughes survived a plane crash in 1943 that left him with multiple fractures and burns severe enough that doctors told him recovery to full mobility was essentially not going to happen for him. He walked out of the hospital and got back in a plane. He survived a second catastrophic crash in 1945, and doctors said the same thing again with even more conviction. He walked out again. A third crash in 1946 left him so badly injured that his doctors were genuinely surprised he was still breathing at all and gave him essentially no chance of meaningful recovery. Howard Hughes discharged himself, returned to aviation, and built the largest private aviation empire in American history, entirely between hospital visits that should have ended him permanently. 46. Harriet Tubman was a young enslaved girl in Maryland when an overseer threw a 2-pound lead weight across a store at a fleeing enslaved man and hit Tubman in the head instead, fracturing her skull in a way that caused sudden, uncontrollable sleep episodes for the rest of her life. The injury also began producing intense, vivid visions during these episodes that Tubman came to interpret as divine guidance, showing her safe paths and warning her of danger ahead. She used those visions as navigation on 13 separate missions through the Underground Railroad, leading over 70 people to freedom, and never once losing a single person despite being hunted the entire time. The weapon meant to control her became the tool that freed hundreds. 47. Thomas Edison had been working on finding a viable filament for his electric light bulb for so long, and through so many failed materials that the problem had become something he thought about constantly, even when he was not actively experimenting in the lab. During one extended thinking session, he was sitting quietly rolling a piece of carbonized thread absent-mindedly between his fingers, the way people fidget when their brain is working on something else entirely. He looked down at what he was rolling around and something connected. Carbon thread became the filament that finally worked consistently inside a vacuum bulb, and the casual, unconscious habit of a distracted genius sitting quietly solved the problem that months of deliberate laboratory work had completely failed to crack. 48. John F. Kennedy was a 26-year-old Navy lieutenant in August 1943 when a Japanese destroyer came out of the darkness and sliced his patrol torpedo boat completely in half at high speed, leaving him and his surviving crew stranded miles from any Allied position in shark-infested waters. Kennedy himself had a serious back injury, but grabbed an injured crewman named Patrick McMahon, who could not swim properly, and towed him for hours through open water by clenching the man's life jacket strap between his teeth while swimming with his arms. He got everyone to a small island, signaled a passing canoe, and orchestrated a rescue that took days. The future president of the United States towed a drowning man to safety with his teeth. 49. Clarence Birdseye was a young naturalist on a fur trading expedition in Labrador, Canada in 1912, doing work that had absolutely nothing to do with food science or the future of American grocery shopping, when he noticed something that the local Inuit people had apparently known forever. Fish that froze instantly in the brutal Arctic air tasted completely fresh and normal when thawed out weeks later, while fish that froze slowly turned mushy and awful. Birdseye filed that observation away, went home, spent years figuring out how to replicate the instant freezing process mechanically, and sold his frozen food patents to Goldman Sachs in 1929 for $22 million. A random observation on a frozen Canadian riverbank created the entire frozen food industry. 50. Desmond Doss was a Seventh-day Adventist from Virginia who refused to carry a rifle into combat on religious grounds, and his fellow soldiers made his life genuinely miserable over it during training, calling him a coward and trying repeatedly to have him discharged before he ever reached a battlefield. The Army sent him to Okinawa anyway, and on May 5, 1945, his unit was ordered to take a brutal clifftop position called Hacksaw Ridge, where the fighting was so ferocious that the men were eventually ordered to retreat and leave their wounded behind. Doss refused to leave and spent the night alone on that cliff, lowering 75 wounded soldiers down on a rope one by one while praying out loud between each one. The man they called a coward saved more lives that night than anyone else on that ridge. 51. Frederick Douglass was an enslaved man in Maryland in 1838 with no legal identity, no freedom papers, and no realistic path to escape until a free black sailor whose name history never properly recorded made one of the most courageous decisions anyone has ever made quietly and without fanfare. The sailor handed Douglass his identity documents, essentially gambling his own freedom on a stranger making it north safely without getting caught and exposing them both. Douglass made it to New York in less than 24 hours, became the most photographed American of the entire 19th century, advised Abraham Lincoln directly on emancipation, and changed the course of American history because one unnamed sailor took an enormous risk for a man he barely knew. 52. Abraham Lincoln lost his first run for the state legislature. Lost again, failed in business twice, had a nervous breakdown, lost a race for Congress, lost a Senate bid, lost another Senate race, and was rejected for a federal land officer position before anyone seriously considered him for the presidency. Any reasonable person looking at that record would have strongly suggested Lincoln find a different line of work and move on with his life. Instead, that accumulation of public failure and personal devastation built exactly the kind of resilience and unbreakable steadiness that allowed him to hold the United States together through 4 years of the deadliest war in American history without once considering quitting. 53. Jan Ernst Matzeliger arrived in Lynn, Massachusetts in the 1870s as a young black immigrant from Dutch Guiana, who spoke almost no English and took a job in a shoe factory where he spent his days watching skilled craftsmen perform the single most time-consuming step in shoemaking entirely by hand. Lasting, the process of attaching the upper part of a shoe to its sole required such specialized skill that it bottlenecked the entire industry and kept shoe prices painfully high for ordinary working people. Matzeliger spent years building a machine that could do it mechanically and patented his shoe-lasting machine in 1883. It cut shoe prices by 50% overnight and put affordable footwear on millions of poor Americans who had never owned decent shoes before. 54. Harriet Beecher Stowe sat down to write Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1851 while simultaneously raising 6 children, managing an entire household largely without help, and grieving the recent death of her infant son from cholera, in circumstances that had left her emotionally devastated and exhausted to her bones. She wrote it anyway, publishing it in installments in an anti-slavery newspaper before it came out as a book in 1852. It sold 300,000 copies in its first year, was translated into dozens of languages, and inflamed Northern public opinion against slavery so dramatically that when Abraham Lincoln finally met Stowe during the Civil War, he reportedly greeted her as the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war. 55. C. Phineas Gage was a 25-year-old railroad foreman in Vermont in September 1848, supervising a rock blasting crew when a moment of distraction caused a 13-pound iron tamping rod to ignite the blasting powder prematurely and fire directly upward through his skull. The rod entered below his left cheekbone, passed behind his left eye, traveled through the front of his brain, and exited through the top of his head before landing several feet away. Gage sat up, spoke coherently to his men, rode in a cart to a doctor in town, and walked into the medical office under his own power. He survived, lived for 12 more years, and became the most studied neurological case in the history of brain science. 56. Jimmy Doolittle walked into meetings with military commanders in early 1942 and proposed bombing Tokyo from an aircraft carrier using Army bombers that had never once taken off from a carrier deck and would have barely enough fuel to reach Japan even under perfect conditions, with no margin for anything going wrong at any point. Every expert in the room told him the plan was not feasible, the physics were too tight, and the risk of losing every single plane and crew was essentially guaranteed. Doolittle said he would lead it himself, and on April 18, 1942-16, B-25 bombers took off from the USS Hornet and bombed the Japanese mainland for the first time in history, shocking an entire nation that had believed itself untouchable. 57. E. Isaac Murphy grew up in Kentucky after the Civil War and became a jockey at a time when black riders dominated American horse racing so completely that they won 15 of the first 28 Kentucky Derbies ever run. Murphy won 3 of them himself in 1884, 1890, and 1891, competing against the best riders in the country on the most prestigious track in American racing, with every wealthy white owner in the sport watching from the stands. His career-winning percentage of 44% across all races he ever entered remains the highest ever recorded in the history of professional horse racing and has never been matched by any jockey of any background in over 100 years of trying. 58. Mary Anderson was visiting New York City in 1903 during a winter storm when she boarded a trolley and noticed the driver struggling so badly to see through the snow-covered windshield that he kept stopping to manually wipe it from outside in the freezing cold. She sketched a rubber blade on a swinging arm that a driver could operate from inside the vehicle, had the device built when she got home, and applied for a patent. Then she approached manufacturers about producing it commercially and was laughed out of every meeting by men who told her with complete confidence that no one would ever want such a device on their vehicle. Mary Anderson died before the windshield wiper became mandatory equipment on every single car ever built. 59. Andrew Carnegie arrived in Pennsylvania from Scotland as a 13-year-old boy with no money, on no connections, and no education beyond the basics when his family came to America looking for a better life than industrial Scotland was offering them. He got a job in a cotton factory as a bobbin boy, earning $1.20 a week, and treated every single task he was given as the most important thing he had ever been asked to do. 40 years of relentless climbing. Later, he sold Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan for $480 million, and then spent the rest of his life giving nearly all of it away by funding libraries, universities, and institutions across America and the world. 60. Jackie Robinson was a lieutenant in the United States Army in 1944 when he boarded a military bus at Camp Hood in Texas and refused to move to the back when the driver ordered him to, knowing full well that military buses had been officially desegregated and that the order was both illegal and wrong. He was court-martialed, stood his ground through the entire proceeding, and was acquitted on every charge before receiving an honorable discharge. 3 years later, Branch Rickey signed him to the Brooklyn Dodgers, and Robinson walked onto a Major League Baseball field on April 15, 1947, permanently breaking the color barrier that had kept black players out of the sport for over 60 years. 61. Dave Thomas was a young restaurant operator in the 1960s who was handed 4 failing Kentucky Fried Chicken franchise locations that were hemorrhaging money and told to either fix them or close them down because nobody at corporate had any better ideas for what to do with the problem. Thomas simplified the menu down to a handful of items, put a rotating bucket sign out front, and turned all 4 locations profitable within a couple of years through sheer operational focus. KFC bought the locations back from him for a significant profit, and Thomas used exactly what he had learned fixing someone else's broken restaurants to build Wendy's from scratch in 1969, eventually growing it into the 3rd largest fast food chain in America. 62. Louis Armstrong was a 12-year-old kid running wild on the streets of New Orleans on New Year's Eve in 1912 when he fired a pistol into the air to celebrate the holiday the way plenty of people in his neighborhood did without much concern, and was promptly arrested by a police officer who had considerably more concern about it than Louis did. The juvenile court sent him to the Colored Waifs Home for Boys, which happened to employ a music teacher named Peter Davis, who put a cornet in young Armstrong's hands almost as an afterthought. Armstrong took to it immediately with an intensity that surprised everyone around him, and that cheap brass instrument handed to a 12-year-old troublemaker launched one of the greatest jazz careers in the history of American music. 63. Francis Gary Powers was a CIA pilot flying a U-2 reconnaissance aircraft over the Soviet Union in May 1960 on a mission that was supposed to be completely undetectable at its operating altitude when a Soviet surface-to-air missile found him anyway and blew his plane apart at 70,000 feet over Sverdlovsk. Powers survived the explosion, parachuted into Soviet territory, and was captured before he could activate the plane's self-destruct mechanism, leaving the Soviets with both a live American spy and an intact American spy plane to show the world. He spent nearly 2 years in Soviet custody before being traded back to the United States in exchange for a captured Soviet spy on a bridge in Berlin, in one of the most cinematic moments of the entire Cold War. 64. Josephine Baker was one of the most celebrated performers in Europe during the 1930s and 40s, adored by audiences in Paris and decorated by the French government. But every time she came back to America to tour, she was refused service at hotels, turned away from venues, and treated as a second-class citizen in the country where she was born. While American establishments were denying her a hotel room, she was simultaneously working as an intelligence agent for French resistance networks during World War II, smuggling classified information past Nazi checkpoints written in invisible ink on her sheet music and pinned inside her underwear. France gave her the Croix de Guerre and the Legion of Honor. America made her use the service entrance. 65. Harry Truman spent his 30s trying to make a go of a men's clothing store in Kansas City with his army buddy Eddie Jacobson. And the business was doing well enough until the economic collapse of the early 1920s wiped them out completely and left Truman personally bankrupt at 38 years old with no savings, no prospects, and debts that would follow him for years. A local Democratic Party boss named Tom Pendergast needed someone trustworthy to run for a county judgeship as a political favor, and offered Truman the slot largely because he needed a warm body with a decent reputation. Truman took it, turned out to be extraordinarily good at public service, and that accidental entry into politics put him on a path to reshaping the entire post-war world order. 66. Chuck Yeager was selected to attempt breaking the sound barrier in October 1947, which was already the most pressure-filled assignment in the history of American aviation, when he went horseback riding 2 nights before the scheduled flight and fell off, cracked 2 ribs, and spent the night in serious pain trying to figure out how to handle the situation. Why he went to a civilian doctor off base to avoid being grounded by the military flight surgeon, got taped up, and showed up at Muroc Airfield on October 14th without telling a single superior officer what had happened. His ribs were so damaged he could not seal the cockpit hatch with his right arm, so a fellow pilot quietly handed him a broomstick to use as a lever. He broke the sound barrier anyway. 67. George Pullman was a cabinet maker and contractor in Chicago in the 1850s who made his early money-raising buildings out of the Chicago mud using a unified jack-screwing system he developed himself before turning his attention to the uncomfortable reality of overnight train travel across America. He designed and built luxurious sleeping cars that transformed long-distance rail journeys from miserable endurance tests into something approaching comfort, and his Pullman Palace Car Company became one of the most powerful corporations in post-war America. The company became the single largest employer of Black Americans in the entire post-Civil War era, hiring thousands of formerly enslaved men as porters and creating an economic foothold for Black families that rippled through generations of American life. 68. Amelia Earhart was invited to join a transatlantic flight in 1928, not as a pilot, but as a coordinator and publicist, essentially there to handle logistics and talk to reporters on the other end, because the men organizing the flight wanted a woman involved for publicity purposes without actually letting her fly the airplane. Then the planned pilot got sick at the last minute, and someone needed to take the controls, and Earhart was sitting right there with a pilot's license and absolutely nowhere else to be. She flew across the Atlantic Ocean, becoming the first woman ever to do so, and did it almost entirely because the man who was supposed to be there called in sick on the wrong morning. 69. Harlan Sanders was 65 years old, recently retired, and had just cashed his first Social Security check for $105 when he looked at his life and decided that sitting quietly in Kentucky waiting to die was simply not something he was interested in doing. He loaded his car with a pressure cooker, his own spice blend, and a handshake franchise agreement he had written himself and started driving from restaurant to restaurant across the American South, asking owners to let him cook his chicken recipe for their staff and split the profits on every plate sold. Over 1,000 restaurants said no, before enough said yes to build a foundation. Kentucky Fried Chicken now operates in 150 countries and serves over 8 million customers every single day. 70. Son Ernest Shackleton's ship the Endurance got locked in Antarctic pack ice in January 1915 and was slowly crushed over the following months until it sank completely, leaving 27 men stranded on the ice with no communication equipment capable of reaching the outside world and no realistic expectation of rescue from anyone. Shackleton made a decision that most people would have considered insane, which was to sail 800 miles through the most violent ocean on Earth in a 22-foot wooden lifeboat to reach a whaling station on South Georgia Island. He made it, crossed uncharted mountains on foot with no proper equipment, organized a rescue, and went back for every single one of his 27 men without losing one life across nearly 2 years of complete isolation. 71. Katherine Johnson was a black mathematician at NASA in 1962 when John Glenn was preparing to become the first American to orbit the Earth, and the agency had just installed brand new electronic computers to handle the orbital trajectory calculations that would determine whether Glenn came home alive or burned up on re-entry. Glenn sat in his capsule, looked at the situation, and told NASA officials he was not launching until Katherine Johnson personally sat down with a pencil and verified every single number the computer had produced by hand herself. She checked them, confirmed they were correct, and Glenn launched. The most important American space mission to that point literally would not leave the ground without her personal sign-off. 72. Sam Colt was a 16-year-old student at a boarding school in Massachusetts in 1830 when he promised his classmates a spectacular 4th of July demonstration involving a floating mine on a local pond that would be detonated remotely. The mine worked, but also covered every single person watching in pond mud and algae, which the school administration found considerably less impressive than Colt did. He was expelled immediately. Colt went to sea on a merchant voyage to Calcutta and spent the long ocean crossing carving a wooden model of a revolver mechanism with a cylinder that rotated and locked with each hammer pull. That bored teenager on a boat invented the repeating firearm that defined the American West. 73. Sojourner. Truth was born into slavery in New York around 1797. Was sold away from her family multiple times before she was 13, and walked away from her enslaver in 1826, carrying her infant daughter because New York's gradual emancipation law was close enough to taking effect that she simply refused to wait any longer. When she discovered her young son Peter had been illegally sold to an Alabama slaveholder, she walked into a New York courthouse with no lawyer, no money, and no legal standing and filed suit to get him back. The court ruled in her favor, making her one of the first Black Americans ever to successfully win a civil case against a white man in an American court of law. 74. Elijah McCoy was a black engineer in Michigan in the 1870s who kept getting assigned to work as a train fireman despite holding an engineering degree from Scotland, because American industry in that era had very specific ideas about what jobs black men were allowed to perform. His actual job involved walking the length of stopped trains to manually oil every single moving part, which had to happen regularly or the machinery would grind itself apart. He got tired of stopping trains and invented a self-lubricating cup that oiled engine parts automatically while the train kept moving. Engineers started refusing replacement parts that were not his specific design, and the phrase "the real McCoy" entered the American language permanently as a result. 75. That Bessie Coleman grew up in Texas picking cotton and decided she wanted to fly airplanes at a time when no American flight school would accept a student who was both black and female, because the combination was simply considered too unusual to accommodate by every institution she contacted. She taught herself French, saved her money, moved to France entirely alone, earned her international aviation license from the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale in 1921, and flew back to America as the first licensed black pilot in the history of the country. Every single school that turned her away watched her return as the most celebrated aviator in Black America, having gone to another continent to get what they refused to give her. 76. Sylvan Goldman was running a Humpty Dumpty supermarket chain in Oklahoma City in 1937, when he noticed that customers consistently stopped shopping the moment their hand-carried basket got too heavy. And heavy baskets meant customers bought less, which meant Goldman made less money per visit. He sat in his office after closing one night staring at a folding chair and had a thought that would permanently change how every American buys groceries. He welded a basket onto a frame with wheels and built a prototype shopping cart that customers could push instead of carry. Shoppers initially refused to use them out of embarrassment until Goldman hired decoys to push carts around the store, and suddenly everyone wanted one. 77. Or Chester Arthur spent his entire political career as a machine politician in New York who had never once won a competitive election on his own merits when Republican Party bosses added him to James Garfield's presidential ticket in 1880 purely as a strategic favor to keep New York's political faction happy during the convention. Nobody seriously expected Arthur to ever do anything more than attend ceremonial functions as vice president for 4 years while Garfield ran the country. Then on September 19, 1881, Garfield died from an assassin's bullet, and Chester Arthur, the man who had never won a single election, was suddenly president of the United States and surprised absolutely everyone by being considerably better at it than anyone predicted. 78. Ida B. Wells was a 22-year-old schoolteacher in Tennessee in 1884 when a railroad conductor ordered her to give up her seat in the first-class car she had paid for and move to the crowded smoking car because of her race. Wells refused. The conductor physically tried to remove her, she bit his hand, and 3 men dragged her off the train while white passengers in the car applauded. She sued the railroad, won in a lower court, and lost on appeal. That experience of being physically removed from a train she had paid for turned a schoolteacher into the most fearless investigative journalist in America, who spent the next decade exposing lynching to the entire country. 79. Nikola Tesla arrived at Castle Garden in New York in June 1884, carrying everything he owned, which amounted to 4 cents in cash, a book of his own poems, a physics article he had written, and detailed calculations for a flying machine he had been designing in his head. He had a letter of introduction to Thomas Edison and showed up at Edison's office essentially broke and entirely unknown. Edison hired him. The 2 men had a spectacular falling out within a year, and Tesla went independent. Over the following decades, he filed over 300 patents covering alternating current systems, radio transmission, and electrical distribution that became the invisible foundation underneath the entire modern electrical world. 80. Chester Carlson was a patent office clerk in New York who invented a dry photocopying process in his apartment kitchen in 1938 and spent the next several years being rejected by IBM, General Electric, RCA, and the U.S. Army, all of whom looked at his invention and passed without much deliberation. A small photographic supply company called Hulloweed finally bought the rights to his process in 1947 for almost nothing, renamed the technology xerography, renamed itself Xerox, and became one of the most dominant American corporations of the 20th century. Carlson received enough in royalties to become extraordinarily wealthy and gave away most of it to charitable causes before he died, having been rejected by every major company in America first. 81. Benjamin Franklin never spent a single day in formal school past age 10, and yet somehow managed to fill the decades that followed by co-founding a nation, serving as America's most effective diplomat in Europe, inventing bifocals, designing the lightning rod, I'm establishing the first public lending library in America and mapping the Gulf Stream current while also finding time to run a printing business and serve in the Continental Congress simultaneously. He survived lightning experiments, transatlantic voyages on wooden ships, and revolutionary intrigue across 2 continents and died peacefully in his Philadelphia home at 84, surrounded by people who loved him, having never once held a college degree. 82. Clara Barton was tending to a wounded Union soldier on a Civil War battlefield in 1862 when a bullet tore completely through the sleeve of her dress and killed the man she was leaning over before the sound of the shot even registered in her ears. She looked at the hole in her sleeve, understood exactly how close that had been, and kept working. So Barton spent the entire war carrying supplies to frontline battlefields entirely on her own initiative, with no official authorization and no military rank. She survived 4 years of battlefield nursing that killed men with rifles and training, and went on to found the American Red Cross, which has provided disaster relief to over 1 billion people since. 83. Philo Farnsworth was a 14-year-old farm boy in Idaho in 1921, walking behind a horse-drawn plow across a potato field. When he looked back at the parallel furrows, the plow was cutting into the earth, and had a thought that had never occurred to any of the professional engineers and scientists actively working on the problem of transmitting moving images electronically. If you scanned an image in horizontal lines the way a plow cuts rows, you could capture and reproduce it electrically. Farnsworth sketched the idea for his high school science teacher, spent years building it, and transmitted the first electronic television image in history in 1927 from a design conceived by a teenager doing farm chores. 84. Elizabeth Keckley was born into slavery in Virginia and spent decades of her life as an enslaved seamstress before negotiating her own freedom by borrowing money from clients she had built relationships with through the quality of her work alone. She moved to Washington, built a dressmaking clientele among the city's most powerful women, and eventually became the personal dressmaker and closest personal confidant of Mary Todd Lincoln inside the White House itself. Keckley sat with the First Lady through the deaths of her son Willie and the assassination of the president, recorded everything she witnessed in a memoir, and became one of the most extraordinary witnesses to the Lincoln presidency that history has ever produced. 85. Benjamin Banneker was a free black farmer in Maryland who taught himself astronomy, mathematics, and mechanical engineering almost entirely from borrowed books and one borrowed watch he took apart and rebuilt from scratch to understand how it worked. In 1789, he calculated and published an accurate prediction of a solar eclipse that professional trained astronomers got wrong in their own published almanacs. Thomas Jefferson read his work, was genuinely impressed, and appointed him to the survey team that laid out the street grid and boundaries of Washington, D.C. A self-taught black farmer who learned science from borrowed books helped design the capital city of the United States. 86. Henry Ford started his first automobile company in 1899, watched it collapse within a year, started a second one in 1901, and lost control of that one to investors who pushed him out before it could succeed, leaving him twice failed and nearly 40 years old with a reputation for being difficult to work with and impossible to back financially. A single remaining investor named John Gray believed him one more time and backed the Ford Motor Company in 1903 with just enough capital to get started. Ford introduced the Model T 5 years later, then the moving assembly line, and put America on wheels, permanently transforming every aspect of how Americans lived, worked, traveled, see, and consumed for the following century. 87. Ronald Reagan spent the 1940s and 50s grinding through a Hollywood acting career that never quite reached the level he was aiming for, watching plum roles go to other actors while he got passed over repeatedly for parts that might have made him a genuine film star rather than a solid supporting presence. The frustration of watching his acting career plateau pushed him into union politics as president of the Screen Actors Guild, where he discovered he was remarkably good at persuading people and navigating complicated organizational conflicts. That accidental political education led to the California governorship and eventually to the White House, where Reagan served 2 terms as the 40th President of the United States. 88. E. Garrett Morgan was experimenting with a liquid to reduce friction on sewing machine needles in his Cleveland shop in 1914, when he accidentally inhaled some of the fumes and noticed that the hairs on a nearby cloth were lying unusually flat after exposure to the substance. He tested it on a dog, then on himself, discovered it straightened hair consistently, and launched a successful hair product business from the accidental discovery. But the bigger accident came when he built a breathing hood using similar principles to protect workers from smoke and fumes, and that improvised device saved 32 trapped miners during a Cleveland tunnel explosion, making Morgan one of the most celebrated inventors in early 20th century America. 89. Jackie Cochran grew up in rural Florida in genuine poverty so extreme she was essentially an orphan being passed between families who needed an extra set of hands more than they wanted an extra child. And she taught herself to fly in just 3 weeks in 1932 because someone dared her that she could not do it quickly enough to use a pilot's license for a business trip she was planning. She used it for the business trip and then never stopped flying. Cochran went on to break more aviation speed, distance, and altitude records than any other pilot in American history, regardless of gender, becoming the first woman to break the sound barrier in 1953 and holding more records simultaneously than any person alive. 90. Where Al Bell was working as a janitor cleaning floors at a recording facility connected to Stax Records in Memphis in the early 1960s, which is not the position from which most people launch careers that reshape American music history. He convinced the owner to let him pitch songs to artists visiting the studio, turned out to be extraordinarily persuasive and genuinely talented at identifying what worked commercially, moved up rapidly through the organization, and eventually bought a controlling interest in the label itself. Under Bell's leadership, Stax Records became the defining force in Southern soul music, producing artists like Otis Redding, Isaac Hayes, and Booker T and the MGs, and permanently shaping the sound of Black American music. 91. Bob Haslam was a 19-year-old Pony Express rider in Nevada in May 1860, when he arrived at a relay station after already completing his scheduled run, to find that the rider who was supposed to take the next leg was refusing to go because Paiute warriors were attacking settlements along the route, and the situation was genuinely dangerous by any reasonable measure. Haslam took the horse anyway, rode through hostile territory to the next station, found that station's rider also refusing to move, grabbed a fresh horse and kept going himself. He rode 380 miles total in 36 hours on a wounded horse, completing the longest single ride in Pony Express history, entirely because everyone else said no and Haslam said, "Fine, I'll do it myself." 92. Sylvester Stallone was so completely broke in 1975 that he stood outside a liquor store in New York, asking strangers if they wanted to buy his dog because he could not afford to feed it and himself simultaneously, and the dog was the one he was more willing to part with. A man paid him $25 for the dog, and Stallone went home devastated. 3 weeks later, he sold his Rocky screenplay to producers on the non-negotiable condition that he star in the film himself, despite the studio wanting a real movie star in the role. The film made over $200 million worldwide, and Stallone immediately went back to that liquor store and paid $3,000 to get his dog back. 93. Sybil Ludington was a 16-year-old girl in Putnam County, New York, on the night of April 26, 1777, when a messenger arrived at her father's house with news that British forces were attacking and burning Danbury, Connecticut, and the local militia needed to be assembled immediately to respond. Her father, Colonel Henry Ludington, needed to stay and organize, but someone had to ride through the dark countryside, warning the scattered militia members across a 40-mile route through terrain that included known loyalist informants and genuine physical danger for anyone moving alone at night. Sybil rode the entire 40 miles herself, roused 400 militiamen, and completed twice the distance of Paul Revere's celebrated ride to almost complete historical silence. 94. St. James Brown was 15 years old in Augusta, Georgia in 1949, when a judge sentenced him to 8 to 16 years in a juvenile reformatory for breaking into cars, which was a stretch of time that by every reasonable calculation should have derailed whatever future he might have had entirely. A fellow inmate named Bobby Bird heard Brown singing inside the facility, was genuinely stunned by what he heard, befriended him, and when Bird was released, he used his family's standing in the community to advocate for Brown's early release. Brown walked out, joined Bird's gospel group, and the two men spent the next several decades building the musical foundation of funk and soul that made James Brown the hardest working man in show business. 95. Bert Shepard was a minor league baseball pitcher and Air Force pilot in World War II, who was shot down over Germany in May 1944. lost his right leg below the knee in the crash, received a wooden prosthetic limb while sitting in a German prisoner of war camp, and used the months of captivity to figure out how to pitch with it by practicing his mechanics alone in the prison yard. He was repatriated to the United States in a prisoner exchange and immediately asked for a baseball tryout. The Washington Senators signed him, put him on the mound against the Boston Red Sox on August 4, 1945, before over 4,000 fans, and Shepard pitched 5 1/3 innings of actual Major League Baseball on a wooden leg. 96. Jan Granville Woods was a self-educated black engineer in Cincinnati in the 1880s who had taught himself electrical engineering through library books and factory floor experience at a time when formal technical education was essentially unavailable to black Americans regardless of ability or ambition. He invented the railway induction telegraph in 1887, a system that allowed moving trains to communicate with stations and with each other, which prevented collisions and saved lives on a daily basis across the American rail network. Both Thomas Edison and Alexander Graham Bell filed competing patent claims against him, trying to take credit for the invention. Woods took both of them to court and beat them both, winning clear legal ownership of his own work each time. 97. Jim Abbott was born in Flint, Michigan in 1967 with one hand, his left, and no right hand at all, which every conventional assessment of athletic development would suggest made a career as a professional baseball pitcher somewhere between extremely unlikely and flatly impossible. Abbott taught himself to pitch by throwing a rubber ball against a wall for hours every day and perfecting a technique of balancing his glove on the end of his right arm to field after releasing each pitch. He made the U.S. Olympic team, won a gold medal, was drafted by the California Angels, and on September 4, 1993, stood on the mound at Yankee Stadium and threw a complete game no-hitter against the Cleveland Indians with one hand. 98. William Carney was a 23-year-old sergeant with the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, one of the first black combat units in the Civil War, already when his regiment charged Fort Wagner in South Carolina on July 18, 1863, in an assault so fierce that the color bearer, carrying the American flag, was shot down in the first minutes of the attack. Carney grabbed the flag before it touched the ground and carried it forward through the entire assault with Confederate fire, coming from every direction, taking bullets in his legs, chest, and arms without once letting the flag fall. He crawled back to Union lines after the assault, still holding it upright, and reportedly told the men who rushed to help him that the old flag never touched the ground. 99. Wilma Rudolph came into the world prematurely in 1940 as the 20th of 22 children in a Tennessee family with very little money, and proceeded to contract polio, scarlet fever, and double pneumonia before she was 6 years old in a sequence of illnesses that left her left leg paralyzed and required a metal brace that doctors told her family she would likely wear for the rest of her life. Her siblings took turns massaging her leg every single day for years. She ditched the brace at 12 against medical advice, and 8 years later stood on a track in Rome at the 1960 Olympics and won 3 gold medals, becoming the fastest woman on the entire planet in front of the whole watching world. 100. Henry Johnson was a 19-year-old private from Albany, New York, standing overnight guard duty in the trenches of France in May 1918, when a German raiding party of approximately 36 men came silently through the wire in the dark, intending to capture American prisoners for intelligence purposes. Sergeant Johnson woke up, grabbed his rifle, fired until he ran out of ammunition, threw the empty rifle at someone, pulled out his bolo knife, and fought the entire raiding party hand-to-hand, alone in the dark for long enough that they eventually retreated back through the wire, leaving behind weapons, equipment, and wounded men. He was found the next morning having sustained 21 separate wounds and was awarded the Croix de Guerre by France, while America waited nearly a century to give him the Medal of Honor he earned that night. 101. Bessie Smith grew up in devastating poverty in Chattanooga, Tennessee, orphaned young, singing on street corners for spare change as a child, before getting a shot at performing with a traveling minstrel show that promptly turned her away because the organizer decided her skin was too dark for his stage. Smith kept performing anyway in tent shows and small theaters across the South Building, an audience through pure force of talent until Columbia Records signed her in 1923. She recorded Downhearted Blues, sold nearly 800,000 copies in its first year, and became the highest-paid black entertainer in America throughout the 1920s, earning the title Empress of the Blues, from an industry that initially told her she was too dark to perform. 102. Elias Howe had been stuck for months in 1845 trying to figure out the single engineering problem, preventing his sewing machine from working, which was where exactly to put the hole in the needle. Because every position he tried caused the thread to tangle and jam the entire mechanism. He fell asleep exhausted one night and dreamed he had been captured by cannibals who were dragging him toward a cooking pot. And he noticed in the dream that every single spear the cannibals were carrying had a small hole near the pointed tip. He woke up, went straight to his workshop, moved the needle hole to the tip instead of the middle, threaded it, and the machine worked perfectly on the first attempt, solving in one dream what months of waking logic could not crack. 103. So Daniel Hale Williams was a black surgeon in Chicago in July 1893, when a young man named James Cornish was brought into Providence Hospital with a knife wound so close to his heart that every other physician who looked at the case essentially considered him already dead and said so openly. Williams opened his chest, operated directly on the sac, surrounding the heart using surgical tools that would make any modern surgeon wince with inadequacy, and closed the wound successfully. Cornish woke up, recovered fully, and lived for another 20 years. Williams had just performed the first successful open heart surgery in recorded medical history in a Chicago hospital with almost none of the equipment the procedure would eventually require. 104. Lewis Howard Latimer was the son of escaped enslaved people, had no formal education beyond what he taught himself, and talked his way into a job as an office boy at a Boston patent law firm after the Civil War, by convincing them to let him try using a drafting set he had taught himself to operate by watching colleagues work. He became so skilled that Alexander Graham Bell hired him to draw the patent illustrations for the telephone application in 1876. He then joined Edison's laboratory, figured out that a carbon filament could be made to last dramatically longer inside a bulb than anything Edison's team had produced. And his improvement was the actual reason electric lighting became practical and affordable for ordinary Americans. 105. Robert Smalls was an enslaved man working as a wheelman aboard the Confederate military transport ship CSS Planter in Charleston Harbor in May 1862, when the white officers left the vessel overnight to sleep ashore, leaving Smalls and the enslaved crew aboard alone with a fully armed warship. Smalls put on the captain's uniform and hat, gathered his family and the families of the crew, sailed the CSS Planter out of the harbor in the early morning darkness, gave the correct signal at each of the 5 Confederate checkpoints they passed through, and delivered the ship, its cannons, its ammunition, and its Confederate code books directly to the Union Navy blockade waiting outside the harbor. He did it wearing a dead man's hat and betting everything on 5 correct whistle signals in the dark. 106. Phil Knight was a Stanford Business School graduate and passionate runner in 1964, who wrote a class paper theorizing that cheap, high-quality Japanese running shoes could disrupt the American athletic shoe market that was completely dominated by German brands, and then decided to actually test the theory by flying to Japan, meeting with a shoe company called Onitsuka Tiger, and importing their shoes to sell from the trunk of his car at track meets across the Pacific Northwest. He shook hands with his former Oregon track coach Bill Bowerman on a $50 investment each, named their company Blue Ribbon Sports, and that trunk of shoes sold out of a station wagon at weekend track meets became Nike, currently the most valuable sports brand on the surface of the entire planet. 107. So Garrett Morgan was riding through an intersection in Cleveland in 1923 when he witnessed a collision between a car and a horse-drawn carriage so violent and chaotic that he went straight home and started designing a solution to the problem of vehicles approaching intersections from multiple directions with no system telling anyone when to stop or go. He built a 3-position traffic signal with a middle warning position between stop and go that gave drivers time to clear the intersection safely, patented the design, and sold it to General Electric for $40,000, feeling like he had made a genuinely excellent deal. The General Electric placed his signal design on road corners across America and eventually across the entire world. And Morgan spent the rest of his life watching his $40,000 invention become one of the most replicated devices in human history. 108. Norbert Rillieux was the son of a French engineer and an enslaved woman in New Orleans who was sent to Paris for his education, became a professor of applied mechanics at the École Centrale, and returned to Louisiana in 1833 to solve a problem that had been killing workers and wasting enormous amounts of energy in sugar production for generations. The existing method of refining sugar required workers to ladle boiling liquid between open kettles in suffocating heat that caused regular burns and deaths throughout the industry. Rillieux designed a closed vacuum evaporation system that refined sugar more efficiently, more safely, and more cheaply than anything previously attempted, and his system was so fundamentally correct that it remains the basic foundation of modern food processing and chemical manufacturing used worldwide today. 109. Jesse Owens arrived in Berlin in the summer of 1936 as a 22-year-old black man from Alabama competing in Olympic Games that Adolf Hitler had specifically designed to showcase the physical superiority of the Aryan race to a global audience of hundreds of millions of people following the event through radio and newsreel. Owens proceeded to win 4 gold medals in the 100 meters, 200 meters, long jump, and 4x100 relay, setting 2 world records and tying 2 others across 4 days of competition while Hitler watched from his private box in the stadium. German crowds cheered Owens louder than almost anyone else competing, and Hitler reportedly left the stadium rather than be photographed congratulating a black American athlete on German soil. 110. Charles Drew was a black surgeon and researcher who solved one of the most urgent medical problems of World War II in 1940 by developing the methods for processing, preserving, and storing blood plasma on a large scale that made it possible to bank blood for transfusions at forward military hospitals across combat zones in Europe and the Pacific. His blood bank system saved a number of Allied soldiers' lives that historians still struggle to fully calculate. Drew was driving home from a medical conference in North Carolina in 1950 when his car went off the road and he was taken to a nearby hospital that refused to treat black patients adequately. Charles Drew, the man who invented the system that saved millions of lives through stored blood, died from injuries that proper medical treatment might have prevented. 111. Harriet Tubman made 13 separate missions back into slave territory after escaping herself in 1849, leading groups of enslaved people north through darkness, swamps, safe houses, and constant danger, with slave catchers, dogs, and bounty hunters actively searching for her across multiple states the entire time. She carried a gun on every single mission and told every person who joined her group before they left that the gun had 2 purposes. One was for slave catchers and the other was for anyone in her group who decided they wanted to turn back, because one person returning could give up names, routes, and safe houses that would destroy the entire network and get everyone killed. She completed all 13 missions, brought out over 70 people, and never lost a single soul. So after everything you just watched, one man survived 2 atomic bombs. A teenager invented earmuffs because his ears were cold. A formerly enslaved man stole an entire Confederate warship in the dark. And a woman who went blind from a scalp condition became America's first self-made female millionaire. Here is the question we need you to answer right now in the comments. Which one of these 111 people do you think had the absolute dumbest luck in all of human history? I'd drop your answer below and fight it out with everyone else, because this comment section is about to get interesting. If this video made your brain hurt in the best possible way, smash that like button, subscribe to Dumb History so you never miss another story that your school was too boring to tell you, and share this with that one friend who thinks they know everything about history. The next video is sitting right there on your screen, and trust us, it gets even weirder.